This is an introduction to cells for the human body. This picture here, we see a large purple blob-like cell that we find in the human body. It's called a macrophage, which means it's a big cell that eats things. And right now it's having some bacteria for breakfast. So how many cells are in the human body? No one knows. I haven't been able to count them. Pretty much we're in agreement that there's trillions of cells, probably hundreds of trillions of cells, but we really don't know how many. Now, when we look at the cells in the human body, we see that there's a lot of variety in both size and shape and structure. And like many things in biology, the structure is important for the function of the cell. So, for example, red blood cells have a very unique shape to them. They're kind of like pancakes, and they're very small, and this allows them to travel through tiny blood vessels and carry oxygen very efficiently. Whereas human sperm cells have a tail for swimming. Neurons have a very unusual structure to them. They kind of look like trees with roots and everything. And some axons, which look like the trunk of the tree, some axons in the neurons are very, very long, and they can extend all the way from your toe up to your spinal cord. So there's quite a bit of variety in both size and structure in cells in the human body, and all of these cells have a different function too. Now, I kind of want you to have an appreciation for the size scale that we're working off of here. So I have a little animation that I want to show you. So this is all about size. So we need to start off with a reference for size. So this is the coffee bean, a grain of rice, 12-point font. Over here in the corner we have a little square, and one line on the square is 1 millimeter. Right. So let's zoom in. Okay. Here's a human egg cell, one of the largest cells in the human body. Look at it compared to the little sperm right next door. Right? Oops. This strange looking cell right here, this is called a photoreceptor, and photoreceptors are important for detecting light and vision. Then we have a human skin cell, the skin cell is about 30 micrometers big, which is somewhat typical for a human cell size. As we get smaller, here's the red blood cell. It's one of the smaller cells in the human body. Now at this point, we are getting to things that would be smaller than a typical human cell. So now we're going to start seeing things that we might find inside a human cell, or just other things that are smaller than a human cell. So here's a chromosome, which you would find in a human cell. Here's E. coli, which you wouldn't find in a human cell generally. Mitochondria are found inside of cells. They're important for making ATP. Now we're getting into the viruses. Right? Viruses are very, very, very small. Right? Hopefully you don't find those in our cells, right? Now we're getting into the size of proteins, like hemoglobin. Antibodies are proteins we would find in cells. Phospholipids in the cell membrane. So now we're getting into like small molecules, glucose, water, and the root of it all, carbon. So hopefully this kind of gives you a better idea of the size scale that we're looking at when we look at human cells. Most human cells can't be seen without a microscope. You need a microscope to see them. So all cells have certain structures in common at some point in their development. And this is true for all cells on our planet, whether it's a bacterial cell or a plant cell or a human cell. They all have genetic material in the form of DNA. All cells have a semifluid matrix inside of them. It's mostly water, but other stuff in the water too. And then there's an outer layer made of lipid that acts as a barrier between the cell and the environment. There are two major types of cells that we find on our planet: prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. Pro means before, and karyo means nucleus. So prokaryotic cells are the cells that were first evolved on our planet, and they do not possess a nucleus. So prokaryotic cells came first on the planet, and they still exist here today. Bacteria such as E. coli are an example of prokaryotic cells. that we might be familiar with today. Eukaryotic cells. The prefix EU means true, so eukaryotic cells do possess a true nucleus. Eukaryotic cells are typically much larger than a prokaryotic cell, as you can see in the picture here. And eukaryotic cells are much more complex. A prokaryotic cell is rather simple internally, whereas a eukaryotic cell is very complex internally. Eukaryotic cells exhibit something called internal compartmentalization. Basically what this means is that there's little different compartments inside of a eukaryotic cell, and we don't see that in a prokaryotic cell. A eukaryotic cell is a lot like a typical house. So a house has walls with separate rooms, right? And there's a room for cooking food, and that's separate from the bathroom, which is separate from the rooms for sleeping. And so you have all these different compartments in your house, and each compartment has its own function. Well, a cell is a lot like this. Cells have little compartments called organelles, and each organelle has its own function. Examples of eukaryotic cells include human cells, plant cells, and fungal cells. Now, when we look just at human cells, there's two major types of human cells, germ cells and somatic cells. Germ cells are the sex cells and their precursors. So this would be sperm in the male and eggs in the female. And then it also includes these cells that make eggs and sperm. Eggs and sperm are haploid, and what that means is that they have half the amount of chromosomes or half the amount of DNA as compared to a typical human cell. The prefix soma means body, and somatic cells are all the cells in your body that aren't germ cells. So this would be the cells in the skin in your pinky, and this would be the cells in your liver, and the cells making up the walls of the ovaries, for example. Somatic cells are diploid, and what that means is that they have 2 of every chromosome. So they have twice as much DNA as compared to a haploid cell. So a somatic cell contains 46 chromosomes, and that's 23 pairs of chromosomes. So we have 2 chromosome number 1s, 2 chromosome number 2s, 2 chromosome number 22s, and so on. Now when we look at human cells, all human cells have certain structures in common. So in this picture here we see a pretty typical human cell. All human cells have DNA inside of a nucleus. All human cells have a cytoplasm with organelles. So cytoplasm is the word for the semifluid matrix inside of a cell. And cytoplasm does include organelles. Organelles are things like the Golgi apparatus, which is the shipping and distribution center of the cell, or the endoplasmic reticulum, which is important for things like making protein. All human cells have a plasma membrane, which acts as a barrier to keep the outside stuff out and the inside stuff in. And all human cells have a cytoskeleton, which is a protein framework inside of the cell. Now, I said all human cells have these structures at some point in their development. And that's important because some cells in their mature state lack some of these things. For example, a mature red blood cell does not have a nucleus, but it did at one point in its development. So I want to talk about some of the things that we find outside of a cell in the human body. So what are some of the things we'd find just outside the cell membrane of a cell? Right? Well, there's a bunch of stuff outside of a cell, and it's a collection of protein and other things, and we call this the extracellular matrix. So it's a matrix of proteins and something called ground substance. The proteins that are common in matrix include things like collagen and elastin protein. And the ground substance is sort of like the filler in between. And it can be a fluid, like in blood. The ground substance is water in the blood plasma. In cartilage, the ground substance is this weird sort of not quite solid, not quite liquid substance. And in bone, the ground substance is actually like rocks, crystals of calcium and phosphate. So depending on where we look in the body, we can see some very different extracellular matrices. So in this picture here, we see a couple cells and some representations for extracellular matrix. Below that, we see different organs, the heart, liver, and bone, and some examples of the different types of extracellular matrix that you might find outside of the cells for those particular organs. In this picture here, we see a cross-section through a cell membrane, and what's nice is that we can see the difference between what's inside the cell and then the extracellular matrix outside of the cell. Now, all human cells have a cell or plasma membrane, and this is the barrier between the cell and the environment. The structure of the cell membrane is that it's made of a phospholipid bilayer, but it's not a pure phospholipid bilayer. This phospholipid bilayer does contain proteins and cholesterol. The proteins have various functions. Some are used for transport, some are used for communication, for example. The cholesterol that we find in the cell membrane is there to help maintain the fluid state of the cell membrane. On the outside of the cell membrane, we will sometimes find carbohydrates that are often used for identification purposes. Now, in terms of function, the cell membrane has many different functions. It's mainly a barrier, but it also is used for transport. So we have to move things into and out of the cell by crossing the cell membrane. The cell membrane is also an important component to cell communication in the human body. And it's important for something called transmembrane potentials. Transmembrane potentials are an important function of the cell membrane that allows neurons to send nerve impulses, and it allows muscles like heart and skeletal muscles to contract. Now, in some places, the cell membrane forms specialized structures. These specialized structures include microvilli, cilia, and flagella. Microvilli and cilia look kind of similar. If you look at this picture over here, the stuff that looks like short grass, that's microvilli, and the stuff that looks like tall grass is cilia. They do have different functions, even though they look similar. Microvilli are typically there to increase the surface area for absorption. Basically, it creates more cell membrane surface area, and this is important like in places like the small intestine where we need to absorb nutrients. This allows us to very efficiently bring nutrients out of the small intestine and across that cell membrane into the cells of the small intestine. Cilia are a little bit different. The cilia kind of have this waving motion that they do, and they can use that to pass things from one cilia to the next. So we can sweep things across the surface of cells using cilia. And this is one of the ways that we can transport an egg along the fallopian tube. It's also how we can pass mucus and debris up the respiratory tract. In some cells, we see non-motile cilia. This is seen like in special senses, such as hearing, and they have a little bit of a different function there. Another specialized structure of the cell membrane is flagella. Flagella are basically tails for swimming, and we only see flagella on sperm cells in the human body.